afternoon, everybody, and welcome to day one of the Fair Education Impact Festival and this session on the impact of lockdown and opportunities for a fairer education system. So as you all know, the festival is for you all as both members of the Fair Education Alliance, but also those of you who are interested in our two awards, our Innovation Award and the Entrepreneurship Award. So before we get started, I'm just going to share a little bit of information about those two awards. If we could just go to that slide. Thank you. These two awards, for those of you who don't know, are open to all of those with early stage ideas for tackling educational inequality, for the Innovation Award, and for all FEA members for the Entrepreneurship Award who want to innovate internally. So you can see some information there about what the awards include. We actually have Tisha joining us on the call today, who leads the Entrepreneurship Award. So please connect with Tisha if you have any questions. And we also have the Innovation Award headed up by Cheyenne, who, for those of you who are on the opening ceremony this morning, delighted us with some live music. So get in touch with him if you have any questions about that. And there's some information there about dates and sessions for you to hear more throughout this festival. So if we just come off slides and we can crack on with the purpose of today's session. So delighted to have this time today on the topic of the impact of lockdown on educational inequality and opportunities for a fairer education system. So we're delighted to be joined by Natalie Perera, Chief Executive of Education Policy Institute, who's going to be sharing some of the insights and evidence about the impact of lockdown on inequalities. And then by Nina Lal, OBE, who is head teacher of St. Stephen's Nursery and Primary in Newham, who will be sharing some reflections from her school and from the front line about the impact of lockdown, what her school has been responding and doing in the wake of that and with regard to inequality in specifically. So thank you so much to Natalie and Nina for joining us today. And we're also going to be hearing by video from a young person, Landre, who is an ambassador with Bite Back 2030, about his reflections on the impact of lockdown on young people like himself and those inequalities. So as I said, this afternoon's session is about the impact of lockdown on inequalities, and the timing of this festival comes at, as Vanessa spoke about powerfully this morning, a really interesting moment. When we last met all together as the Alliance in November, we were still in the midst of the pandemic, and we were talking a lot about the here and now and what how to respond to the lockdowns, and we still had a lockdown to come. We're now, as we emerge slowly out of lockdown, the narrative is starting to change. And as we've heard really clearly from so many of you, there's no doubt been a huge impact of the multiple lockdowns and the results of what's happened over the last year. And it's been all too easy for some of the media and even our own narrative to focus on some of the challenges, because they are real, of course. There's the digital divide. There's the gaps that have been exacerbated between rich and poor and different socioeconomic backgrounds in a whole host of ways. The fact that we haven't all been in the same boat, it's been realised the impacts for different communities and different people in very different ways, the wellbeing challenges and many, many more. But what we have heard really clearly from you as our members is that there's an opportunity here as well to see the positives and the opportunities coming out of this crisis, the things we've learned about ourselves and about each other, and really what has been shown to be possible when push comes to shove, when we really need to make things happen, and what we've learned about being able to do that. So the FEA community has said very clearly that we want to see this moment as a time to address and take action on some of those inequalities that have long since existed and seize those opportunities that have come about. And that's what today's session is really about, those opportunities for a fairer education system in the moment we find ourselves in. So in a short while, I'm going to hand over to Natalie, but as we start all of our Impact Festival events with, we're first going to break you out into some small networking groups. and we want to get you talking. So we're going to put the question in the chat now, which is, how has lockdown impacted inequality in education for good or bad? And what are the opportunities and what are the challenges? So Gina is about to break you all out into some small networking groups, and if you can have a chat based on that question, and we'll come back in about 4 minutes. Welcome back, everybody. So I'll now hand over to Natalie Perera, who's going to share evidence and reflections on the impact of lockdown and opportunities for a fair education system. Over to you, Natalie. Just on mute.
It's a good start, isn't it? Thank you, Sam. I'm Natalie Perera. I'm the Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute. Arguably more important, I'm a trustee of the Fair Education Alliance and very happy to be joining you today. I'm going to attempt to share my screen now, and hopefully this will work. Right. Sam, I can see you. Can you wave at me if you can see my screen? Brilliant. Okay, I'm going to canter through these slides quite quickly in order to give some time for questions at the end. But essentially what I will be talking through is what the situation looked like for disadvantaged young people just before the COVID pandemic hit, and then what we know so far about some of the impact of COVID on young people's learning and inequality, and what we think needs to happen next. So if we look first at the size of the disadvantage gap in 2019, so this was before the pandemic hit, we can see here that disadvantaged pupils, so those eligible for the pupil premium, were just over 18 months behind their more affluent peers. We see a gap of just over 9 months in primary and just over 4.5 months in secondary. And what's important to understand here is that particularly in the early years and secondary, over the last few years, we have seen progress in closing the gap starting to stop. So i.e. the gap is no longer closing, and in fact it's starting to widen. In primary schools, we have tended to have a really good news story about attainment and narrowing the gap. But again, in 2019, we see the first sign that the gap in primary school is starting to widen, or has started to widen too. So pre-COVID, things were already fragile, and there are signs there that things were getting worse in terms of education inequality. When we dig beneath the data a bit more and we look at our group of pupil premium children, we find something really interesting. So this graph tells us looks at the different quintiles of pupil premium children. The bottom line tells you those who have been eligible for free school meals for 20% or less of their time at school. And then the quintiles go up until you get to that high persistence group. Now, this group of pupils have been eligible for free school meals for 80% or more of their school lives. What that tells you is that for the majority of their lives, they have been in poverty, in poor families persistently. And for them, for that group, the gap has barely changed at all. So for all of the other children who have been in and out of free school meals, we can see some degree of closing of the gap since 2011. But for those pupils who are in persistent and long-term poverty, there has been barely any change since 2011. And that group is larger. So between 2017 and 2019, the proportion of high persistent children in poverty increased by about 2 percentage points. So then we look at what happened after the pandemic. We have been analysing real-time assessment data that happens in schools using Renaissance Learning assessment data. So these are assessments taken in primary and secondary schools in reading and maths. And what this tells us is when we analysed the data from the first half of the autumn 2020 term, so when pupils came back immediately after the summer holidays, we found that they were about, in primary schools, they were between 1.7 and 2 months behind where they ordinarily are in reading, and about 2 months behind in secondary reading. And in primary school maths, they were just over 3 months behind where they would normally be. We didn't have a big enough sample size to look at secondary school maths, but this basically tells us that there's about a 2 to 3 month loss of learning when children came back immediately after the summer holiday. And we see that there's variation in that learning loss across the country, ranging from 1.6 months in the West Midlands to knocking on 2.5 months in the North East. And this really reflects the general regional trends we see when we look at overall attainment and disadvantage gaps. Sorry, I'm just moving my screen a little bit. And we see a similar pattern when we look at secondary pupils reading as well. And then we looked at how learning loss varied depending on the demographic of the school, and particularly how what proportion of pupils they have that are eligible for free school meals. And again, what this graph tells you is that schools with higher proportions of pupils eligible for free school meals, i.e. schools serving poorer and more disadvantaged communities, they tended to experience the largest loss in learning in primary and secondary reading. So we're seeing learning loss overall, but in some regions more than others, and amongst poorer pupils and poorer schools compared to more affluent pupils and schools. We'll be updating that data over the next few weeks and months, looking at the second half of the autumn term, and then importantly, looking at what happened during that first period, that later period of lockdown between January and March this year, where we expect that learning losses will have continued. So what does the government need to do next? We published a paper today that states quite clearly the government needs a very ambitious recovery package to address the scale and cost of lost learning. We estimate that to be between 10 and 15 billion pounds over the next 3 years. That sounds a lot, but it's nowhere near as high as what we estimate the economic repercussions of the pandemic to be if we do nothing. That recovery package needs to focus on providing high quality teaching in schools and support for wellbeing and mental health. It also needs to look beyond schools and improve quality and access in the early years and post-16 phases. We'll be saying more on all of this in around the middle of May, including the kind of policies that we think the government should be funding to early year schools and colleges over the next 3 years. So that's everything from me. Over to you, Sam, for questions.
Fantastic. So we've got one question in the chat already, and if others have questions, please do pop them in the chat. And we'll pass them on to Natalie. So first question, Natalie, is from Jill Attenborough at Country Trust, who says they're keen to direct their opportunities and programmes towards children experiencing persistent disadvantage, though they do work with primary schools, and so we'll be looking at the school level rather down to specific pupils. Are there geographic pockets of persistent disadvantage, and have these been mapped, or is a high percentage of FSM a reasonable proxy?
There are lots of ways of looking at disadvantage. So high proportions of FSM or pupil premium is one of the best proxies. You can also look at local area area measures, including the IDACI measure. It's a bit more complex. But I think if you're looking at a group of schools and you look at FSM or pupil premium, that will give you a good idea of their level of disadvantage.
And does that show that level of persistent disadvantage as well, Natalie? Do you think there's the correlation between higher levels of FSM will show that persistent disadvantage?
Not necessarily. On our website, where we published our annual report, you'll be able to see the levels of persistent disadvantage by local authority, but we don't go beyond that at the moment.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Please feel free to raise your hand as well if you'd like to verbally ask your question. So we've got another question from Alex. I'm not sure which organisation Alex is from, but how will the moving of the FSM census collection this year affect the disadvantage? Alex is from Villiers Park. Hi, Alex.
Yeah, so there's been lots of scarily high estimates of the amount of funding that will be lost this year. I can't remember off the top of my head, but we're talking about hundreds of millions in some local authorities. So yeah, I think it's fair to say that the £1.7 billion that the government has put into education catch up in the last 2 years, some of that will be wiped out by the loss of funding due to moving the FSM data collection date.
Thank you. We probably have time for one more. I know Natalie has to jump off to go on TV. So Claire, you've got your hand up.
Hi there, Natalie. Thanks for the presentation. Hi. I just wondered, you mentioned that the support package, and I know you're announcing further information later on this year, would include some support around wellbeing and mental health. Do you have a high-level vision at all of what that might be, what that might include?
Yeah, so we're clear that recovery for young people needs to go beyond academic support.
Yeah, definitely.
But we're looking at a combination of what we might think about more formal wellbeing and mental health support, including more counsellors and experts, kind of professional help in schools, through to more informal activities, including extended schools and summer schools as well.
Excellent. Thanks very much.
No worries. Good to see you, Claire.
Thank you so much. So I think, Natalie, you're going to need to drop off now, aren't you? So thank you so much for joining us.
Have a great day, everyone. Bye.
Brilliant. So with all of that insight from Natalie, before we move to hearing from Nina and from Landre, we're going to break you out again into small conversation groups to just digest what we've heard and have some small group discussions. So the 2 questions we'd like you to consider in small groups now is, what surprised you about the content of Natalie's presentation? What were your takeaways? And what are the key challenges and opportunities for educational inequality coming out of lockdown? So I'll just put those questions in the chat now, and then Gina will break you out. So what surprised you about Natalie's presentation, and what are the key challenges and opportunities for your work? So I hope you had some insightful conversations there, and starting to explore those takeaways from what Natalie shared so far, and those opportunities and challenges for each of your work coming out of this side of the pandemic, or this chapter of the pandemic. So we're going to have a couple more inputs now from, first of all, a young person, Landre, who is a Bite Back ambassador. So some of you may know Bite Back is a campaign around healthy eating, and it's led by a group of young people themselves. And as you know, at the heart of the Fair Education Alliance is making sure that youth voice is put front and centre of all of our work. And no more important than talking about the impact of lockdown, we definitely need to hear from young people themselves. So we have a video now, I think, ready to share, which Gina will now play from Landre.
Hello, my name is Landre Adeleye, and I'm a Bite Back 2030 Youth Board member. Educational inequality is and lockdown. You know, that it's a really hard topic to like kind of grasp because you know there's so much you can talk about but there's so little time. I think I think where you have to start basically is the digital divide. I think, you know, learning from home, it's kind of become apparent that you can't learn from home without a good, decent computer. And loads of people from poorer backgrounds are so disadvantaged with what they can do. Like, not everyone has a computer to every single member of the family. Like, obviously, for me, I'm lucky to be able to not have to share my like tech with anyone else in my household. But I know that's um, not I know that's not the case for loads of people. Some people only have their parents' phone to learn on, and that's not great. And you know that shouldn't be the case. Um, so I think the way lockdown has affected inequality in education, it's not affected it. It's basically highlighted that it's there, and I don't mean like you know the quality of education. There'll always be a difference in the quality of education we all receive around the countries because you know we're brought up in different system, we might be brought up in a different system, a different school. There's so many factors that can play into that. But what I'm talking about is like, for instance, homework, extra learning at home. Loads of people are disadvantaged because maybe the only place they can properly do their homework is in the school library because you know they don't have the resources at home. So it really has kind of highlighted that, you know, not everyone has the ability to learn from the comfort of their own homes, unlike, you know, some other people who some may say privileged. I think the challenges have definitely been how can you keep students engaged? I think that's one of the challenges. I mean, like for me, doing Zoom lessons every single day from the same four walls is was tiring. And you know, I can't understand what it would be like for someone who was younger. Obviously being a year 13 student, I think for people in my year, they kind of took it, you know, they took it as a joke, be like, yo, we don't need to do exams. Why are we doing this? But I can't speak for other year groups. But I know definitely the challenges are is that like as much as some people hate school, you can't argue that being in an actual classroom is actually brilliant. Because in terms of like being engaged, even if it isn't fully engaged, you're more engaged being in a classroom with like physical people instead of on 20 squares on your screen than being in your home with the camera off, just flicking through Instagram. Honestly, that's definitely been one of the challenges. And opportunities. Just thinking about this now, like it might sound stupid, but like especially like snow days. This might sound like really stupid. But I think what we've learned is that we don't have to totally shut schools when, you know, we can't physically be here. Like it was only last year where people be like, oh, you know, if we can't physically get there, we'll just have the day off and we'll just do normal homework. But I definitely know that we can change that now, to an extent. But yeah, I hope that was all right.
I feel like I want to say something. That was definitely all right. That was so wise and it made so much sense. So we will pass that feedback on to him afterwards. And I'm sure you'll all agree with me that that was really, really helpful and insightful to hear from Landre. Thank you, Hannah. We will. Hannah's just put her details in the chat there. So if you have any feedback for Landre, the details there are to get in touch with Hannah, and then she'll pass the feedback on as well. Fab. So we'll now move on to hear from Nina Lal, who is head teacher of St. Stephen's Primary and Nursery in Newham. And we've asked Nina to share some reflections following. We gathered together 12 head teachers from across the country in the National Schools Forum that we meet with once a year. And Nina was one of those head teachers. And we met in the week following schools returning after the most recent lockdown back in full in person. And what struck us was the optimism and the amazing, like, magical stories that the head teachers were sharing about the kids returning and that opportunity and what the schools were doing. So we've asked Nina to join us today to give a bit of a flavour of what her school has been doing in response to the return to school, the implications of lockdown, and what those challenges and opportunities have been for her. So Nina, if I can hand over to you, please.
Hi everyone. Really, I'm probably going to start with a bit of context about where the school is and some of the factors that are that we faced, you know, that we were facing pre-COVID as well. So St Stephen's is a group of 2 federated schools, but we're on the same site. So we've got a 3-form primary school, but we've also got a nursery school with daycare and a children's centre, and we also have midwifery services on site as well. So it's quite a large site with over 800 pupils and over 120 staff. So it's quite a huge team there. But I think one of the real positives about having all of those services on site is the fact that it shows how much part of the community the school is. So of course, when children weren't in school during the lockdown, we were finding we were finding that we were losing those connections and those relationships. So of course, the children's centre and the staff in school then did more outreach work to actually tap into our communities to make sure that they were you know, and I think it also highlighted to us that school is more is not just about the academic, it is more about the relationships, and it is more about community support as well out there. So I think that was one of the really big takeaways. Working in Newham, I've worked in Newham you know, for over 25 years. There are high levels of deprivation within Newham, with over 13,000 claimants of incapacity benefit. 98% of our community are from ethnic minorities, with over 33 languages represented. We have about 11% of our pupils that have SEN support, with 93% of our children whose first language is not English. So already the challenges are there. So our children at St Stephen's enter the nursery well below national averages, but by the time they leave at year 6, they do incredibly well here. You know, and I'm really proud to say that St Stephen's was a primary school of the year in 2017, and we've also maintained that level of attainment for the last 5 years, remaining in the top 10 schools, you know, across the country, which is some achievement for a school in Newham. So I think what I want to really try and say is that it can be done, and I think it's about the ethos and the positivity of the school, and going back to community, about knowing your community and what it is that they respond to. So it was really interesting to hear from the young person talking about the digital divide. We just had a bit of a chat in our breakout room about the devices. So obviously the government gave us devices, we had devices at home, but we were finding that about 40 to 50% of our children weren't able to use those devices at home because they had no support. And so for primary school children, it was, we very quickly decided that we weren't going to do complete online lessons because it didn't suit our children. So we did a bit of a blended learning where we had some work was in workbooks and worksheets, and we gave out reading books as well to our children throughout the period. And where we found that the children were accessing the online devices, we did a bit of both. So in Key Stage 1, we did more wellbeing sessions with the classes each day, as opposed to actual teaching online, because that was all done then through more blended learning. Really, I think the ethos of the school has always been about unpacking barriers to learning, and what is it that stops our pupils from learning, what is it, and the real drive to actually track those children to see where the gaps are. So again, I was saying earlier that in primary school we're always closing the gap. Yeah, the gap might have gone a little bit wider, but actually our job is always closing that gap. So the key thing for us, really, I would say, sorry, I've just got a few more figures as well. So we had an increase of 57 families in the last year in terms of free school meals as well. So that highlighted some families who possibly weren't availing some of the things that were out there. During lockdown, our numbers went up quite considerably. So really the impact for us is, I mean, the first things were the children were delighted to be back at school. Honestly, the smiles on their faces and the positivity that was there when they first entered, it was honestly heartwarming. It really was. And I think which goes back to the fact that the schools are, it's not just about the academic, it's about relationships. It's about being part of something. It's about being sociable. It's about being with your friends. It's about having that time to be physical as well. So for us, we've and just to go back again a little bit to the devices and the online stuff, I've got to give credit to our teachers and our staff here, who within a really short amount of time learned to have a whole new way of working, and they were really incredible. So I have to big up the staff in the school as well. So the impact for us, really, there were, I would say, two or three really. The first thing is the physical development. Our children came back to school quite sedentary, and their physical development had not progressed in any way during that last year. So we felt that part of our kind of recovery curriculum and our recovery program had to up the physical, and especially in the nursery we found that as well. And then the second main thing for us was becoming sociable again and working within a team and learning how to play in the playground again, because actually they hadn't done that for 6 to 8 months. And I think the thing that we've got to that I've always said at St Stephen's is our children will catch up. We will make sure our children catch up academically, but the real things that we need to focus on is the physical side and also the social side. So our curriculum, we've actually altered our curriculum to combat that. So every day our children are doing more physical activity. We're making sure that at playground and lunchtime there is more provision for that, because that in turn, of course, supports communication and language, and in turn again supports social and emotional development. So it's all really linked. And then the second thing was we looked at our curriculum, and because again our children haven't been on any school visits or educational visits for a whole year, so that whole lack of enrichment and immersive learning, we thought, well, how can we bring that into the classroom? So we have actually changed our curriculum round to ensure that those more immersive experiences are taking place. So really those are the main things for us. But I have to say we're so fortunate to have a children's centre here on site, because early intervention from skilled professionals is the thing that will close that gap. And I cannot sing the praises enough of the nursery team and the children's centre team, who were instrumental in making sure that our children were okay and our families were okay. So that's kind of it in a potted version. There's lots more that we did, but I'm sure you didn't want to hear just a full list of that. But I'm really happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Nina. And it's always so, I think, important to always go back to the importance of teachers and leaders. It's one of the FEA's shared 4 priorities to support teachers and leaders first and foremost, because they're the ones doing that great job on the front line. So thank you so much for that, and all the wisdom that you've shared with us about what's going on at your school. So yeah, we do have some time for some questions. So like with Natalie, feel free to either pop them in the chat or raise your hand and speak the traditional verbal way, whichever you wish. Catherine.
Hey, thanks, Nina. That was an excellent talk, actually, very interesting. And I was particularly interested when you said that, you know, academically, you'll make sure your children catch up, but the things that really matter are the sort of social contact, the well-being. And you sounds as if you're making positive moves to address that. And I just wondered, you know, are a lot of schools in your area doing that? How widespread would that be across the country? You know, this thing of you'll make sure your children catch up, and then the whole social dimension, which has been such an important discussion all through COVID and wellbeing.
I suppose that's a difficult one, because I can't really talk about what's happening in other schools. I mean, obviously I know what's going on in here, but I'm also part of the Teach First National Forum, and within that we could see that the schools there were very positive about closing that gap. And I think it's what good schools do automatically. I mean, that is our job, isn't it? Is to teach and make sure the children are learning and they are getting to those expected levels. Now, you know, as I explained earlier at St Stephen's, our children are very they come in very below the expected, and in some ways that's due to our families being a little bit over nurturing. They're actually too nice to our too supportive of our children, and not allowing them to be independent and not allowing them to explore for themselves. And so it's actually talking to the parents and explaining to the parents the benefits of you know, letting your children do things by themselves, you know, at what and age milestones are really important as well, because you know, we have children here who things like toilet training and things like still drinking milk from a bottle, etc., till quite late. And it's just about educating the parents to make sure that those children are getting that head start before they come into school. So for us we're always working at it. There's always something that we can do, and I would hope that most schools would be doing that. So I can't talk unfortunately on behalf of other schools, but that's what we do here.
Thank you. And while other people are thinking of questions, so picking up on the conversations that happened in the breakouts, and obviously we'll have been identifying some of the opportunities and challenges. I'm interested, Nina, overall, do you see the kind of events of the last year as an opportunity for tackling inequalities in education, or more of a challenge, or a bit of both?
Yeah. I think it's a little bit of both, because right now what it has done, it's revised our whole curriculum and how we teach, and we've actually picked out what is really important right now. And for us it's the physical, and for us it's talk, vocabulary, communication. And so that's where our immersive curriculum supports that level. So what we now need to do is to marry that with the pressures that we have in terms of getting our children to be SATs ready. And you know, what's been lovely this year, I have to say, is that we've not had that pressure to get them to that level. So our children will continue to do well here, but you don't have that pressure of that exam pressure, I would say. It's a different kind of pressure. Obviously our standards and our expectations will still be at that level, but to prepare children for SATs is a very different kettle of fish from you know, what we're doing right now. So I think it's challenging. So once SATs etc comes back in, the challenge then will be is how do we marry the physical and the immersive with the SATs ready, which is you know, what we have to do, I suppose.
Fascinating, fascinating.
Yeah.
So we've got 2 more questions, and we'll go to Anna and then we'll come to Jill. Anna first.
Oh, thank you. Hi, Nina. It's lovely to hear from you, and I'm so inspired by the commitment that you have to your pupils in the school. And I just really wanted to ask, in talking to other schools in the work that I do, and some of the challenges you mentioned they were also facing, did you find that parents in some instances were accessing the resources? Because I'd heard that in some cases parents were actually learning along with some of their children to upskill themselves, mainly in schools where I guess EAL was quite high. But did you find that yourself?
Absolutely. So that's why we then changed our remote learning offer to so in Key Stage 1 we said that all of the actual kind of academic work will be done on kind of worksheets or workbooks, and then the Zoom calls were just wellbeing calls really. But for secondary, we actually had parents bringing their laptops in to talk to some of our assistant head teachers on how to even switch it on and access Zoom. So that is how basic things were. And so what makes me really sad is listening to the young person who spoke before me is you kind of think, well, why didn't all the laptops just go to secondary schools, and then primary schools could have carried on you know, with whatever it is that they were doing? Because again, it's that community side, knowing your school, knowing your children, knowing your parents, knowing what their levels of access to devices are, and working around that. So yeah, I think you've got to be quite brave, quite a brave leader to say, actually, you know what, I'm not going to do that, I'm going to do what's right for here. And that's you know, precisely what we did. So if you look at our website, our whole remote learning offer is on there, so you can see what each year group did and how it all kind of evolved. So that's, if anybody's interested in having a look, it's all there.
That's fantastic. There's a real theme emerging today, I think, in terms of knowing the communities and knowing the children that we're working with, and that the events of the past year have, by necessity, kind of forced us to really go with the need of each child, each school, each community. And it's really interesting there, Nina, when you're talking about if only the laptops could have gone to secondary where they were needed, and actually you were fine. And it's that kind of that knowledge of each individual school and community could help us so much with limited resources, do so much more. So I think it's really interesting, and Vanessa talked a little bit about that in the opening ceremony this morning, about celebrating the diversity of our country and the uniqueness of each community. So that's definitely emerging as a theme for me today. Jill, over to you for a question.
Thank you, and thanks, Nina. Really inspiring, really fantastic to hear what you're doing. I have messaged you, but we offer exactly the kind of experiences related to food farming in the countryside that you're talking about, so supporting the things that you need. But kind of more generally, teachers have got so much that they're trying to absorb at the moment. How can we make people like us, how can we make ourselves easily accessible to teachers to access what we have? And then also, how can we help teachers to sustain the impact of these interventions? Because I know that many families aren't going to be able to do that. So teachers are really crucial individuals for children. How can we help teachers to sustain that? So how do we make ourselves accessible? How can we help you sustain it?
Yeah. So I'm going to do the sustainability one first, because I've got an answer for that. I'm not sure about the first bit. So the way we work educational visits here is that we always make sure we do some pre-work. So we make sure we do about a week or a few sessions on pre-work. So for example, pre-COVID, we used to take our children to the ballet, because none of our children probably have ever been to the ballet. I've never experienced anything like that. But what we would do is, so for example, if it was the Nutcracker, we would make sure we got the books in school, and we would do a lot of pre-work around it. So the children go into that experience having some kind of background knowledge into it. And then when they go for the visit, everything makes sense, as opposed to them being kind of, you know, just trying to plug gaps. And then we always make sure that we do some post work after it as well. So some kind of outcome in terms of a book or a play or a piece in a newsletter, or some kind of post work. So I think to do educational visits or kind of experiences in isolation is where it becomes a little bit token, I would say, and just tick in a box. Whereas if you've done that pre-work, then you have that immersive experience, and then you do the post-work afterwards. That is what gives it that holistic, memorable kind of tick to it all, really. And that's what makes children remember it. It's repetition and just consolidating that learning. So the first bit was about how do you get into schools. I know it's really tough, and I know, but the thing is, we get bombarded with
that's the thing.
So, you know, obviously my office staff at the first instance cull everything, so I get a very streamlined version. Otherwise I would be, you know, just sitting doing emails every day. Every school has an educational visits coordinator. That might be your first port of call. The other thing would be maybe network meetings, local authority network meetings for educational visit coordinators, where you could go and maybe pitch a little bit there. Those are the ways I would get in. Directly emailing schools, yeah, you'd be lucky if you get a reply from a head teacher, I'd say.
Thanks very much.
If that's helpful. Yeah.
Thank you, everybody. So thank you so much, Nina, and for answering such a wide range of questions as well. Answering on the spot, I know is sometimes challenging, but you've done a wonderful job, and we're so grateful to have had you with us today. So we're now going to spend the final 30 minutes or so drawing on what we've heard from Natalie, from Nina, and from Landre, and think about the implications for all of your work and our work collectively. So we're going to break out into 5 groups, and we're going to use the trusty mural, which many of you may have used before, some may not. So we're going to, Tisha's just going to put the mural links in the chat now. When you click on the link, it will open up a mural document. You can join as visitor, so you don't need to sign up if you've not registered for mural at all already. And you'll see there's 2 questions on there. If you join one for now, but then we'll break you into groups, and you can join the relevant group, group 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But you'll see if you open one of those that there's 2 questions. What are your takeaways about the impact of lockdown on educational inequality? So drawing on what we've heard from all of our speakers today, what are your takeaways? What's the impact of lockdown been on educational inequality? And you've got the yellow post-its there. For those of you who haven't used it before, to create a new post-it note, you can just click on it and press Control-C, copy, and then Control-V to copy a new post-it as well. And the second half is, what might the opportunities be for your work? So this is where we'd really like you to focus in this breakout. What are the opportunities for Anna, for you at Teach First, or Claire, I think Causeway? What are the opportunities from where we are post-pandemic, coming out of this, I don't know if we're post-pandemic, but this next chapter of pandemic, for tackling educational inequality, and what might be those opportunities for us to seize? So Gina's going to break us out now into 5 groups, and if you can select the, we'll put the mural link in each of the conversations, and if you can join that and fill in those post-it notes, and we will come back in 10 minutes, sorry. So at 15:15, and fill in and share back some highlights from each group. Welcome back. I hope you had some great discussions. So we're just going to take 1 point from each room. So I'll go to group 1 first, and if one of you can volunteer to pull out your best either takeaway or opportunity that you want to share with everybody else. Group 1.
It's probably better be me, because I took responsibility for doing all the typing. I think there was a feeling that a lot has been invested in getting things like tech working and blended approaches, and there is potentially an opportunity there to kind of keep some of those gains going forward by kind of having sort of blended approaches. So we had Anna from Teach First in our group who was talking, for example, about how they have, you know, stopped doing as much face-to-face, obviously, but actually they've realised that there's lots of stuff that you can do there, not face-to-face going forward, even though obviously there's lots of things you can't do as well without it being face-to-face. So that blended approach for the long term, big opportunity, we thought.
Awesome. So opportunity number one, blended approach for the long term. Thank you, group one. So group two was Catherine, Claire, Mark and Wendy. Your top takeaway or opportunity, and let's have a different one to group one.
Well, I wrote them down again. I'm Mark from Talk the Talk, so perhaps I'll pick out the first one, which interested me in particular, and I think is very true because it's the holy grail for head teachers. It's the fact that parents have suffered in many cases just as much as children in lockdown, and there's a likelihood, we believe, that the say pupil premium children, they may come from families where the parents have suffered in particular, and that may be contributing to the widening of the gap. And research needs to be done there, and more work into how we can help parents re-engage their students in education. And that's something head teachers are always asking us, you know, what oracy for kids, great, yeah, we got that sorted, we're offering that, but how can we get parents involved there? So that's one of our big takeaways.
Thank you, group two. So opportunity to I guess support parents more than we've ever done before, and I think that's a really interesting one, in the sense it was one of the Fair Education Alliance's shared collective priorities even before lockdown. And yeah, there's definitely this kind of opportune moment where parents have suffered and their children have suffered potentially as a consequence of that, and how might we seize the moment for parental engagement. We have a couple of sessions on parental engagement through the Impact Festival, including, we'll be talking about our priority on parental engagement at the FEA Shared Agenda session tomorrow. So if any of you are interested in that, do come along to that session. Over to group three, Charlotte, Laura and Becca.
I guess if we're following the trend of people who did the writing, I'll say for our group. So something that I think we were very inspired by what Nina was saying in our group, and our big takeaway was kind of the development of those soft skills that maybe with all the catch-up narrative around education being lost, that soft skills aren't being focused enough because they're assumed, it's kind of relied on that those are being developed outside the classroom, and actually you're not having that same backgrounds outside of the classroom. And whether there are problems with the fact that because they're not measurable, they're not being targeted or captured. So then maybe, given that it's an opportunity to be looking at the curriculum again, whether as we're talking about catch up, how to include the development of soft skills in that catch up. So I kind of just combined three different points, so I hope that made sense.
Yeah, it made complete sense, and absolutely. I think, again, thinking about the FEA shared priorities, which has existed long before lockdown, of that developing the whole child, developing skills and social emotional competencies alongside academic attainment. I think it's very definitely a huge opportunity that all of a sudden people are realizing, oh, that was important the whole time, because it's shone a light on the fact that we were kind of, I love that, Charlotte, kind of relying that it was happening magically somewhere else. It reminds me of something that Landre said around he said something like, lockdown hasn't necessarily affected inequality, it's just shone a light that it was already there. And I think similarly, I feel like some of this stuff it's shone a light that we needed this focus on wellbeing and skills already, even though it was already there as well. So great one, thank you, group three. Over to group four, Hannah, Jill, Stephen, and fortunate to have Nina.
I'm happy to go for group four. So yeah, we had a big talk about just the importance of school leadership. That, you know, how young people are going to bounce back from this, and how the education system's going to bounce back is very much in the hands of school leaders. And the good and outstanding school leaders will have plans of how they're going to do this. They know how to support their young people. They know sort of their communities the best, they know the parents the best. So I think recognizing that for all of us in organizations that are outside schools, that you have experts on how to do this in the school, and it's working with them with what they need, and that might be different in different places with different school leaders. So realize that you're working with experts who already have an idea about how to do this. So how can you add value and how can you support with that?
And we had one, is it group 5 groups we had in total? So yeah, group 5, Alex, Miffy and Roger.
Great, so I'm happy to share for our group. I think we've kind of said pretty much the same, lots of the same things that the other groups have already said. I think our overwhelming opportunity, I guess, from this, we were talking about how sort of the purely academic recovery leaves a lot of gaps in the resilience and ability for young people to sort of progress and achieve their future pathways and that sort of thing, but that there's this opportunity for a bit of a culture change in schools, and it's taking that time to reset and consider what's important, so that the extracurricular and wellbeing offers are in place to support students and enrich their learning. It's that opportunity to take a fresh look at what's important. So yeah, that was our biggest takeaway, I think.
Thank you so much, everybody. And I've just written down those 5 kind of opportunities and takeaways, and what really strikes me is the mirroring actually of our collective Fair Education Alliance priorities and agenda that we obviously had before lockdown anyway, and then this has given us an opportunity to take it forward even more. So that kind of developing the whole child, developing skills and social emotional competencies, that support for school leaders and school teachers as the people who are closest to young people on the front line, know what they know, the children, they know the context, they know what they're doing. So how can we as that FEA community support them in the best way? And then also that parental engagement piece. So as I said before, we actually have a session tomorrow as part of the Impact Festival on the FEA shared agenda, where we'll be looking at those 3 priorities and our 4th one, which is support for post-16 opportunities and the different work that's going on across the Alliance. So really interested to see that mirrored as an opportunity at this moment to take forward. So that is the end of the session. Thank you so much for joining. I'm going to hand over to Tisha now for 5 minutes of wrap up and some quick feedback.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Sam. So first thing I think to say is just a huge thank you to Natalie, Nina and Landre and you all for such a great session. So I would love if you could all join me in coming off mute for about 10 seconds just to give everyone a big round of applause and a huge kind of virtual thank you. So woohoo! Thanks very much, everyone. And your feedback is super, super invaluable to us, especially since this is the first year that we are running the Impact Festival. Do feel free to send us an email with immediate thoughts, and Gina will pop the email in the chat, but we'd also love to get your kind of immediate reactions through a poll that Gina has just launched. So if you could take a minute, please, to complete the poll, that would be fantastic. And Gina, if you give me a shout when we've got everyone done.
They're coming in, Tish. We have about 27% so far. So if you haven't voted yet or polled yet, take your time. It's really helpful to know the feedback from this. And I have put the email address also in the chat.
Great, thanks, Gina. Cool, so if you could take the last few seconds to wrap up. Fab, and was that a thumbs up, Gina? Everyone good to go?
continue. And if you haven't voted yet, keep on going in, but feel free to continue, Tish.
Great, cool. Keep the poll open if you haven't voted. Do give us your immediate thoughts so we can iterate quickly and make the rest of the sessions impactful and useful. So just thank you all so much for such a brilliant afternoon, and we really look forward to seeing you at the rest of the Impact Festival throughout the week. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you all for joining.